why do we develop coping mechanisms? And the answer, I think, is very simple. Is if you think about the type of environment that we face within organizations that we are part of, or even in our life, there's an acronym that you could use to describe these environments more fully, and it's called VUCCA, V-U-C-C-A. The V is for volatility. There's volatility in the demand and the supply on us as human beings. The U is for uncertainty. There will always be uncertainty about what the real causes or effects are of actions. The first C is for complexity. There's lots of interdependencies between parts of the system. The second C is for constraints. We will always face constraints in time, in money, in resources, or even policies that we have to adhere. And the last one is A for ambiguity, is we are often given multiple objectives and it's not very clear which one should we focus on. So what happens if we put people within such an environment and we ask them to make decisions? Is a very practical way of coping with that type of complexity and uncertainty is that we develop coping mechanisms. Coping mechanisms has an upside, and the upside that it literally allows us to cope with this enormous complexity and uncertainty. But they also have a downside. And what we have to continuously check is, how do these relate to each other? Is the upside of our coping mechanisms really much more than the downside that they can experience? Let's look at an example. If you think about a government agency, you face tremendous complexity and uncertainty in making a decision around how to best allocate our scarcest resources in terms of budget and human resources. So what is the coping mechanism when somebody faces such a complicated decision? Because you don't want to be allocating too much or too little. You need to have enough budget and people to deal with the demand that's placed on your agency. So the coping mechanism is, because it's such a hard decision, we don't like to make it often, so we do it once a year. We have a budget once a year. So is there any downside of this coping mechanism? Well, what happens is, if I'm doing it only once a year, I have to predict ahead of time for the next year what the total demand will be on my agency. If I get it wrong, I'm either going to have too much resources or I'm going to have too few. We then make it worse in having a rule of spend it or lose it. I'm sure many of you have heard about this, not just in governments, by the way, but even in private sector organizations. So what happens as a result of this rule is, if I was lucky enough that there wasn't so much demand on my agency that year, I might underspend. But because of this rule, I will feel pressure to spend it or I'll lose it. If I was unlucky enough that there was a very high demand, I might not have enough budget or human resources, and I might have to require more. And as a result of this coping mechanism, almost regardless of how much safety we add within our agencies in terms of budget or human resources, we will never have enough. Because we will constantly make the mistake of having too much or too little, and then facing the pressure of spending what we have. So that's a quick example of the type of coping mechanisms that we develop. The type of examples we'll see is that we often come up with static rules. Because it's so hard to make the decision, we don't want to make the decision frequently, so we make it once off and then never adjust. So just having a different mechanism that allows us to adjust more frequently based on what a real demand is can really help to improve the situation and ensure that we can best utilize our scarcest resources. So it's something that I often ask my customers to think about, is to say, considering the complexity and uncertainty, the kind of VUCCA in your environment, what are the coping mechanisms that you've developed? And could this be the Achilles heel in your environment?